Just more data, I don't think, is the answer. In some instances, it can, and space offers some really unique aspects. But a lot of times, for instance, if you're going to use data to fight in disaster response, and you've got national or federal, then you've got state, then you've got local organizations that need the data, making sure you understand what's stopping that data from being shared from within the different organizations to deal with a national response. Is it funding? Is it technology? Is it concerns over privacy? Is it concerns over liability?
Hey Space Watchers, a while ago a LinkedIn post got my attention, written by Laura Delgado Lopez about a recent published article about the gap between the space and geospatial sectors. Following our own work on the geospatial and geo-int area, I was curious to learn more about this work of Laura. And Laura co-authored the article together with Kevin Pomfret, partner at Williams Mullen Law Firm and founder of the Center for Spatial Law and Policy. And today, I have the pleasure having Kevin in our Space Cafe radio studio. Kevin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well today, Torsten. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I look forward to talking about this topic. It's something that's of real importance. Laura and I both believe it's of real importance, so I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it.
Great. Can we start our journey with some scene setting? What is the issue of the gap between space and the geospatial sector?
So I think the main gap is that many aspects of the new space or space society right now is a space ecosystem, if you will, is based on Earth observation, communication, and PNT. And putting communication aside, which is obviously very significant, the other aspects, Earth observation and PNT, have a very strong geospatial component to it. And the challenge is being able to use the data or the services that are being developed or allowed by these technologies on Earth for the useful applications that they can be provided for. And much like space is subject to regulations and laws and policies, geospatial information is as well. Now, it's not necessarily as clear and direct as it is in the space context, but there are a legal and policy framework that impacts the ability to collect and use and share and analyze geospatial information and products and services based on that. And so if those frameworks don't align with what you're trying to do with space, then you run the risk of creating a disconnect, if you will, between the two. And in the long term, the risk is that the money, assets, goodwill that's used to create these space societies doesn't get the bang for the buck, doesn't do the things that it is being sold to the public as being able to do. So that's, in a nutshell, is the disconnect that we tried to touch upon.
Okay, let's try a structured approach to dig into that. On one hand side, space is called a driver for innovation and development, especially when we're talking here about the global south, countries using space to inspire their next generation, to inspire people for doing something great. And we all know if you study our STEM, any of these STEM topics, it doesn't matter if you do space or you build a car or machinery or you're going to AI or whatever it is. You have profound knowledge at the end acquired. So what is the significance of the disconnect between the space and the geospatial sector in emerging space ecosystems? And again, particularly in the global south.
So let's put aside the inspire aspect of this, right, for the next generation. And let's just focus on the practical application. Particularly in the global south, the concern and getting into space is not around human space flight or some of the other goals and objectives of the space powers like the United States and China and Russia. They're much more interested in at least in what they're saying in terms of using data and using space assets to deal with issues around disaster response, agriculture, migration, real practical issues that they're dealing with on a daily basis. And so if you're going to build a space program with those as being your primary objectives, your primary drivers, you need to make sure that at the end of the day, when that data is collected, when the products and services are being built, that you have the infrastructure, you have the people who can support that, you have the budget that can support that, you have the legal and policy framework that allows that data to be used in a way that supports the applications that you've built it on. And so if you don't do that, if, for instance, your space program in the global south or in anywhere is harbored in a defense or intelligence agency, and they restrict the access to that data because of national security concerns. Because one of the issues is both the space and the geospatial sectors have very significant national security, military defense applications associated with them. And so if you place those space activities in those organizations, it sometimes can be difficult for it to be used on some of the activities that you're selling it for. So agriculture, or sharing it for disaster response, because there are national security concerns associated with it, even collecting it. If you're tasking it to deal with borders or unrest in certain parts of the world, it can be difficult to task it on food security issues or disaster response. So those type of things can impact your budget and your goal and objectives in developing a space program. So what we tried to discuss is why it's important to think about those when you're rolling out a space program or you're developing a space ecosystem in a particular country, regardless if it's in the global south or in the developed world. These issues are the same, but the global south has a unique opportunity to address those because many of them are just starting. They've been involved in space for a while, a number of them, but they are looking to play a bigger role. The technologies allow them to do more than they were able to do before, but they still have these issues on the ground that they're going to need to deal with if they want to get the full utilization of the technology.
It reminds me a bit about the ongoing conversation in the States about the declassification of Earth observation data from the various agencies and who can do what with what kind of data. So that's interesting. When we talk about you wrote in this article about the communities, the stakeholder that has to be included. So what are the communities that you hope to be impacted by space into the discussion on how a space program should be established and operated? So who are the stakeholders at the end you want to see there?
I think there's a lot of stakeholders, and that's one of the challenges with geospatial because it cuts across so many different applications and so many different government agencies on both the civil and the defense and intelligence community sides. For instance, in the United States, NASA, NOAA, Department of Interior, Department of Transportation, many agencies, Department of Commerce, just to name just a few, have very significant roles and responsibilities associated with geospatial information. Many of those are impacted by Earth observation data from space or can be improved by Earth observation in space. So they participate in various levels with some of the discussions that are taking place within the Earth observation enterprise in the United States. I think I can't off the top of my head because Lauda is the Latin America space expert. I'm more the geospatial person, so I don't know all the different agencies within Latin America, but I do know that there are agencies within each of those countries because all of them are dealing with geospatial and all of them are dealing with all the different aspects. So the agriculture community, the transportation community, the disaster response community. If you're going to use Earth observation data to deal with some of the challenges of geospatial, then they should be at the table helping to drive this. And they should be at the table and addressing issues around the access to the data, how it's being collected, who's paying for it, how you have the resources to process the data and analyze it in a way that you want. There's a large ecosystem that needs to be developed after you collect the data, and then it needs to be integrated with other data types from other agencies. So maybe from the Defense Department, or maybe from local and state governments that have their own data sources. So how do you deal with those? And who has responsibility from a legal standpoint to address those? And who has the authorities to do that? Not just a wish, but who has the legal authority to make sure that takes place?
You just mentioned Latin America, and I don't want to push you into too many details, and I hope that my next question can be answered by you on a broader frame, because I would like to understand what are the drivers of the various programs. Let's phrase this. Why do space programs in regions like Latin America prioritize societal applications over the classic prestige-driven goals of traditional space powers like US, Russia, or China? Is that zeitgeist?
I think it's a combination of different things. And again, this is more of an area for Lauda to talk about. And I encourage you to read her report that she published at CSIS that talks about sort of the drivers, domestic and foreign policy in the Latin American space program. In general, though, my understanding, and it seems to align with what Lauda has said in her report, is that one is just money. It's very expensive, as we're finding out here in the United States, to have a human spaceflight program. It's very dangerous. It takes a lot of resources, and a lot of countries in the global south at this point don't have the ability to do that. Another is they're not caught up in the global space power game that the big countries that you just mentioned are. For good or for bad, they have chosen to align themselves with one or more of the parties, and maybe they'll send an astronaut from their country to participate in a program. So they are playing in that area a little bit, but they're not dedicating significant resources at this point to develop a human space program. But also, I think, because they have maybe learned from what has happened over the past 20, 30, 50 years and seen the technology is allowing them to develop real important applications that are dealing with issues that are of utmost importance to them now. And so they're seeing space as an opportunity to do that. My guess is some of them, and I don't know, but some of them, assuming space continues to grow and they have success and they develop a commercial and governmental ecosystem around space, would love the opportunity to do some of the things that US, China, Russia, and even India are doing now. But I don't think that's a priority because for the reasons that I've described. And that's why one of the reasons we wrote this article is because that's why it's even more important for them, I think, and to make sure that they have the legal and policy framework on the ground to support the money and resources they're allocating in space, because that's going to ultimately decide how successful these programs are, not just from a prestige standpoint, but from a practical standpoint in terms of making society better, making their people feel like their money that they've spent is worthwhile, making their lives better. So then maybe they can do some of the other things they want to do.
Let's stay a moment on the governance side here. So how does the integration of space and geospatial governance, to name it policy, laws, regulations, impact the success of space investments in emerging countries? Let's call it new space as we have seen it 10 years ago in the US and in Western Europe.
Well, I think we're still early days yet in terms of what's required in terms of for these countries to be able to say that their investment is paid off and what the governance and legal structure is. As Lauda highlighted in her report and in the article, there are cases such as in Mexico and Chile and other countries where the geospatial and the space sector are getting together and contributing to trying to work together to address some of these issues. But there have been hiccups along the road, and some of those obviously are going to happen in any government program. But some of them are because I think space in particular is territorial, but also geospatial is territorial. There's authorities, there are budgets associated with that. And I think we're still in the early days to see in this new space era as to what the framework, whether the frameworks that are being developed are able to support how people want to use the data that's being collected from satellites on the ground. I do think it's a unique opportunity because many of these countries are in the process of either developing or revising their space policies, if you will. And it's important when they do that, in my opinion anyways, to not just think about the Outer Space Treaty or the Moon Treaty or all of the other treaties that more traditional space lawyers are focused on. And I don't mean to diminish the importance of those, are very valuable. But for many of these countries, I think as much value is making sure that the data that's being collected is able to be used. And in my world anyways, that means understanding the geospatial factors that are going to impact your ability to collect and use the information for agriculture, disaster response, civil transportation, all of those things that are often cited as reasons why you want to develop a space program in the global south.
As you just mentioned, Mexico and Chile as one of the examples in the report that we will put obviously in the show notes for this show, that everyone can have a deeper look into it. But how does countries like Mexico and Chile bridge this gap between the space and the geospatial sector? And more importantly, what can others learn from their approach?
And I hate to keep on doing this, but Lauda, as the Latin America expert, has the expertise and, again, talks about these in the report that you'll put in the notes. I know Mexico has contributed to a Caribbean-wide space initiative, I believe a geospatial center as part of this, so that the data that's being collected can be processed and analyzed and used across the Caribbean, I believe, for weather-related incidents, right? Because that's one of the things that space is really good at dealing with. But once you collect that data, you need to be able to use it. You need to be able to share it. So that's one thing. I believe Chile, their National Space Council, has the agency that's responsible for the spatial data infrastructure, which is a term of art within the geospatial community that deals with all the geospatial information that government agencies, for the most part, collect and how they share it. And the Space Council has included someone from this agency as part of their council. In addition, I believe there's a draft of the space law that references the importance of this council in the development of the space industry. So I think the first level is simply just recognition that this is part of it, including people in the process. Now, that's nowhere neat. You can't stop there. You need to make sure that these organizations have a role. You need to make sure that you're thinking about them not just as a contributor, but also as a customer, essentially, of the information that you're collecting. And then you need to develop a framework that supports that, the authorities to do what needs to be done, a data sharing framework that makes sense both from an economic standpoint, a national security standpoint, and then a policy that supports, if your goal is to have a commercial ecosystem, to be able to support the development of that, which isn't necessarily intuitive. But if you want to develop this new space that you're talking about, increasingly that requires a commercial sector that is vibrant and is able to contribute to this both on the space side and also on the geospatial side.
Talking about this commercial sector was a great leadway into my next question. The US is the biggest and the most advanced market in this sector, but still there's a number of questions and challenges. And what are the implications of the lack of integration between the space and the geospatial governance on the success of commercial remote sensing sectors, particularly in the States?
So as you've said, the United States has probably the world's largest and most successful space program, and also on the geospatial side. It is a tremendous opportunity and tremendous market for companies and organizations that wish to do business here. And we have had some success, so I don't mean to minimize that. But we also have institutions that have been around for a number of years with different authorities and different responsibilities. And because geospatial cuts across so many sectors of society and is regulated by so many different aspects of different government agencies, and actually, and frankly, because the U.S. government is, in many sense, a competitor to commercial space, in the sense that it also has its own remote commercial Earth observation assets that it's providing. So when you have an industry, and both geospatial and the space sector, where the U.S. government is both a regulator, a competitor, and a customer, it gets really messy. It gets really confusing. And some agencies have different responsibilities, even within the agency. Some may be a regulator and a customer. And then you need to bring, because the U.S. is a quote-unquote competitor, you need to bring the defense and intelligence communities in to talk about what they're going to collect and how they're going to use it. Then you overlay export control rules and foreign ownership rules. So we have this legacy that we've built on, and it can make it a real challenge for commercial observation companies to work their way through, to satisfy the government procurement rules, to satisfy the national security concerns, to satisfy the open data concerns that the U.S. has imposed. All of those things are, in my mind, obstacles that the commercial Earth observation industry within the United States has to, and foreign companies that are coming here to sell to the United States, have to deal with. And they're often not talked about in the space context. In some instances they are, but often they're not talked about in terms of, okay, how does this impact the work we're doing in space? And if we think the new space economy is going to be built on a vibrant Earth observation industry and GPS and PNT, how do we support that so the rest of the new space economy, whether it be the launch, whether it be communication, can benefit from that? That's the intersection I see in the United States.
That's interesting that you still consider these different areas, especially here in the procurement process. I think earlier this year we had a number of interesting announcements around the Space Symposium in Colorado Springs that the U.S. Army and the U.S. Space Force brought out their policies for commercial actors to their own procurement program. So how can they procure easier and more structured data and assets from the commercial market? So it's interesting that it's a pretty slow process, but it's a process.
But just to add on that, if giving the Army and the Space Force the authority to do that impacts organizations such as the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the NRO and others that are also involved in this process and have been for years and have budgets associated with that and have analysts and plans associated with that. So even that what intuitively makes sense in terms of maybe giving greater access to certain government agencies have very significant impacts throughout the U.S. government. And there are a lot of politics involved in Congress and other halls in the United States. So even simple things even things that seem simple have significant impact. And frankly, for the commercial industry, uncertainty, roadblocks, discussions and battles within Congress or between Congress and the White House or between government agencies, all of that hurts an industry that just wants to know what the rules of the road are and being able to know who they can sell to, and so that they can tell their investors, so they can plan on future growth. That's the type of thing that I was talking about. And hopefully those are some of the lessons that the Global South and other parts of the world can recognize as hindrances, and maybe they can avoid because they are starting from a different point. They don't have some of these legacy things in place.
From your point of view, as someone who is very much involved in it, is it a good process? Are you on the right way? You're coming from this mega structure of agencies that sometimes maybe have watered their goals, why they have been established in the first instance and then started to have their own developments. Is it good to lower these burdens and maybe shift a few of these processes?
I think it could be better. I think the U.S. government could do a better job of aligning what it's trying to do and aligning its space and geospatial in a lot of different ways, not just in this aspect. So, yeah, I do agree that it can be better. It's probably better than any of the other options that are currently being used. I don't mean to state that it's working, but it is very difficult for the government to procure data. It's very difficult to procure space services. And we're seeing it's very difficult to figure out how to deal with dual use technologies, which both space and geospatial are. And changing those rules and regulations is difficult, but for new space to succeed, some of those are probably going to have to change if we want to get full benefit. And again, I'm talking in the US, but I think more broadly, that's going to happen in countries around the world. And geospatial is going to be a big part of that. It's not the only part, and I recognize that space is much bigger, but it's an important aspect that I don't think that divide is being discussed or considered enough.
I see. Let's talk about lesson learned. So how can emerging space ecosystems leverage fewer legacy structures to better integrate space and geospatial communities for more effective governance framework? It sounds a bit like the 1 million question, but what are the lessons learned that you would offer to the Global South or any other country?
So I don't think there's one size fits all solution, because I'm a lawyer and I recognize that legal systems and governments and governance varies across the globe. Every country has it different. And that's one of the challenges around Earth observation and communication, and because we can transfer data from one part of the world to the other in milliseconds, right? But the law in one place is very different than the other. The government has different concerns in one place than the other, right? So the US has its own set of strengths and weaknesses from that standpoint. Other countries have their own. I think the lessons that can be learned, and frankly, I see some of this in India, which is developing a vibrant space policy, but also a vibrant geospatial policy. And frankly, because the geospatial community in India is so strong, and there are some individuals who have really pushed this, there is an integration, if you will. And space policy, geospatial policy are coming out at the same time. Now, they're separate, and they have separate organizations and structures and governance, but you can see them moving at the same time. And I think that's important. I think, like we've talked about with Mexico and Chile, simply recognizing that these other stakeholders are very important and in bringing them into the process, having them included in the councils, referencing them in the law, giving them authorities with respect to space is important. But I also think it's important for when you're looking at developing a space program, particularly around Earth observation and PNT, to address concerns on the ground. It's really valuable to look at why more terrestrial solutions aren't working. So if it's going to be Earth observation, why aren't crewed aircraft or drones or other types of resources that collect data, why isn't that enough? Just more data, I don't think, is the answer. In some instances, it can, and space offers some really unique aspects. But a lot of times, for instance, if you're going to use data to fight in disaster response, and you've got national or federal, then you've got state, then you've got local organizations that need the data, making sure you understand what's stopping that data from being shared from within the different organizations to deal with a national response. Is it funding? Is it technology? Is it concerns over privacy? Is it concerns over liability? Understanding what that is, and I held a tabletop several years ago around fire and using Earth observation data for fire and geospatial information. And certainly more availability, and some of the sensors that are being put on Earth observation satellites are going to be important. But a lot of the issues are at the state, federal, local level, being able to share data and at a price and in a way that makes sense and having the technology in place. So I think thinking about it from that standpoint, particularly if you're building your space program around geospatial activities, will help you identify what the friction points are so you can address them in your, I don't want to say space policy because it may be totally outside your space policy, but you understand how your space policy interacts with the work that's being done on the ground.
Kevin, thank you very much. I had one other question prepared about the way forward, but you perfectly integrated it already in your last answer. Thank you very much for your time. It was a great pleasure talking to you, and please keep up the great work that you guys are doing. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Torsten. I really appreciate it.
If you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Cafe Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Torsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.